Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your stack of source material, strip away the academic clutter, and distill it down to the crucial, unforgettable insights you need.
And today, our mission is a big one.
A very big one. We're diving into the mind of a true American giant, a figure whose intellectual output didn't just comment on the nation, but you could argue effectively created its philosophical DNA.
We are talking about Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Exactly.
And we are really getting into the foundations of American thought here. Emerson, who, and this is an important detail, preferred to be known by his middle name, Waldo. He was an absolute polymath.
He really did it all.
Our sources confirm he was a minister, a philosopher, an essayist, a poet, just a massive literary figure, and on top of all that, an immensely popular lecturer.
Right. But more than any of those single job titles, he was the acknowledged leader, the sort of gravitational center of the entire Transcendentalist movement in the mid-19th century.
His influences, frankly, it's impossible to overstate.
And we're talking about the Sage of Concord, a figure who transcended mere American literary fame. His reputation was truly global.
Oh, absolutely.
It's fascinating to look at the global reach of his thought. I mean, you see that major European thinkers acknowledged his genius. For instance, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Not exactly a man known for handing out compliments.
Not at all. And Nietzsche considered Emerson the most gifted of the Americans.
And if you look closer to home, the figures he influenced are just foundational. Walt Whitman, the poet who, sang of the nation's body and soul, openly called Emerson his master.
Wow.
That kind of intergenerational acknowledgement shows that Emerson was a cultural pivot point. He was bridging the European intellectual tradition with something completely new and distinctly American.
So our goal for you, the listener, is twofold. First, we need to move beyond the sound bites and understand the core radical concepts that define American individualism.
Things like self-reliance and the oversoul.
Right. And why they were so revolutionary. Second, we are going to trace the incredibly surprising and often paradoxical path of his own life.
Because this wasn't an academic philosophy born in a library.
Not even close. It was forged in the fire of deep personal loss, religious crisis, and national controversy. We're going to unpack the scandal he created at Harvard, the influence of Eastern philosophy on his most famous concepts,
and the difficult, complex reality of his evolution on the issue of race and abolition.
It's the story of a man who preached utter independence, but was ultimately, and maybe ironically, shaped by external pressures.
A fascinating contradiction.
Okay, let's unpack this journey, starting with the unlikely origins of the great individualist.
Let's do it.
Emerson was born in Boston in 1803. He had this long lineage of ministers stretching back centuries, but that path was, well, it was fractured for him very early on.
Yeah, his father, who was a respected Unitarian minister, died when Ralph Waldo was just 8 years old.
A huge trauma right at the start.
It was formative, and it meant he was raised predominantly by his mother and his aunt, Mary Moody Emerson.
And this aunt was a huge figure in his life.
Oh, monumental. While his mother provided stability, Mary Moody Emerson was the intellectual and moral firebrand in the family. She maintained a constant, intense correspondence with him for decades, right up until her death in 1863.
What was she like?
She was a deeply intellectual, pretty eccentric figure who pushed him continually toward intellectual rigor and self-examination. She was, in many ways, his first great intellectual sparring partner.
We see that he attended Harvard, which was pretty much expected of a boy from his background, but his time there suggests he was far from a prodigy.
Not by institutional standards, no.
He attended at age 14, which is incredibly young, but graduated smack in the middle of his class of 59.
And that fact, graduating in the exact middle, is perhaps the single most revealing detail about his time there.
Why do you say that?
Because he wasn't excelling in the highly structured classical curriculum of the time, which, it favored rote memorization and tradition. He wasn't wired for that.
Because he was too busy with other things.
Exactly. He was too busy working and reflecting.
What kind of work was he doing just to stay afloat?
He was taking on odd jobs to cover expenses, which is a real testament to his family's financial situation after his father's death. He served as the freshman messenger for the president.
Which sounds like what? Running errands?
Pretty much. Running errands, chasing down overdue students, and acting as a kind of internal liaison. He also worked as a waiter for the junior commons and took occasional teaching jobs.
So his life was a constant juggle.
It was a struggle between institutional requirements and just sheer personal necessity.
But the real intellectual work, the stuff that mattered, wasn't happening in the classroom. It was happening in his private notebook.
That's it, exactly. Midway through his junior year, he began a journal series he titled Wide World. This was his real education. It was a place for unfiltered observation, philosophical musings, and personal reflection.
And these weren't just diaries.
No, no. Scholars today look at those notebooks, which evolved into his journals, later published in 16 large volumes, and they consider that ongoing process of self-documentation to be his single most important literary work.
So it's where all the raw material came from.
Precisely. It's where the raw materials of his philosophy were first collected and worked through.
That intellectual self-discovery was then accelerated when he was forced to travel south for poor health in 1826.
A common practice at the time for consumption or respiratory issues.
Right. He went to Charleston and then to St. Augustine, Florida. And what sounds like a physical recovery trip turned into a true intellectual awakening.
He was pulled out of that rigid Boston environment and immediately encountered this really important figure, Achille Murat.
Murat, he was Napoleon's nephew, right?
The nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte and the son of the King of Naples, a fascinating cosmopolitan character. He was only 2 years older than Emerson, but he had this worldly perspective that just shattered RWE's limited provincial view.
What kind of impact did he have?
Emerson later called Murat an important figure in his intellectual education. Their discussions were broad and, for the young Unitarian minister, pretty radical. They talked about religion, philosophy, and government from a European post-Enlightenment perspective.
It was a crucial exposure to thought outside the box he grew up in.
It broadened his universe, just as he was starting to seriously question his own career path.
And while he's having this intellectual broadening, he has a stark, visceral confrontation with the deepest moral hypocrisy of the American experiment.
Slavery.
Yeah.
This personal encounter in St. Augustine marked him deeply. He wrote about the disturbing dissonance in his journal. He was attending a meeting of the Bible Society.
A group dedicated to spreading Christian scripture and morality.
Right. And simultaneously, right outside the building, a slave auction was taking place.
The juxtaposition is almost unbearable to even think about.
It is, and Emerson captured it perfectly. He highlighted the moral blindness required to hold these two activities side by side. He wrote, "One ear therefore heard the glad tidings of great joy, whilst the other was regaled with 'Going, gentlemen, going.'"
Wow.
That image Christian charity and the brutal commodification of human life happening at the exact same time is a powerful early indicator of the hypocrisy he would later reject in all forms of organized religion.
So the intellectual crisis was already brewing, fueled by that moral contradiction. But then came a profound personal tragedy that fully broke him away from his chosen path.
The loss of his first wife, Ellen Louisa Tucker.
Yeah.
They married in 1829, but she had tuberculosis. She died less than 2 years later in February 1831. She was only 20 years old.
And this was a catastrophic blow for him.
Completely. The grief wasn't just immense. It led him to an act of mourning that is still shocking to read today, nearly 2 centuries later.
It's just an unbelievable detail.
It speaks to the depth of his emotional turmoil and his desperate need for some kind of tangible, final closure. A journal entry from March 29, 1832, records the astonishing detail.
What did he write?
He visited Ellen's tomb and wrote that he opened the coffin.
This isn't just grief. This is a profound existential confrontation with death. It drove him to violate one of the most sacred boundaries of his time.
And it underscores the intense emotional landscape that lay just beneath the surface of the calm philosophical essayist we think of.
And all of this personal turmoil was set against his professional background. He was the junior pastor of Boston's Second Church.
He had stability, a good salary, civic duties, all the markers of success.
Yet that stability felt suffocating to him.
The Unitarian Church, for all its liberalism compared to traditional Calvinism, still felt like a cage of what he called dead forms. He realized the institutional trappings were preventing him from being the spiritual guide he felt he was called to be.
So what was the final straw? What caused him to resign in 1832?
It came down to the ceremony of the communion service, a specific theological disagreement about ritual. Emerson did not believe in the ritualistic commemoration of Christ's body and blood. He found the whole ceremony unsuitable.
So he made a stand.
He did. He recorded his rationale with his characteristic clarity, essentially saying his own internal experience superseded any external tradition. He wrote, "This mode of commemorating Christ is not suitable to me. That is reason enough why I should abandon it."
And by walking away, he wasn't just leaving a job. He was setting a precedent for his entire philosophy to come.
Exactly.
He was rejecting the inherited rituals and finding justification solely in his own internal sense of truth.
Precisely. As one scholar put it, by leaving the pulpit, he was free to choose the gown of the lecturer and teacher, of the thinker, not confined within the limits of an institution or a tradition.
He swapped the inherited authority of the church for the earned authority of the lecture hall.
A perfect way to put it.
That spiritual rupture led to a necessary physical journey. In late 1832, Emerson left the U.S. for what became a pivotal trip abroad, and this fundamentally changed his intellectual trajectory.
This tour, which lasted through most of 1833, was an intentional pilgrimage to meet the leading lights of European romanticism and intellectual life.
Where did he go?
He spent time in Italy, seeing Rome, Florence, and Venice. In Rome, he made the acquaintance of John Stuart Mill, the great liberal thinker, who then facilitated introductions for him in England.
And the English visits were massive for his professional trajectory, especially his connection with Thomas Carlyle.
Carlyle was a crucial bridge figure for him. Emerson met with Wordsworth and Coleridge, but his relationship with Carlyle was far deeper and more professional. Emerson immediately took on the role of Carlyle's unofficial literary agent in the U.S.
Really?
Yeah, handling the promotion and publication of Carlyle's works in America. They maintained a constant correspondence, a relationship that lasted nearly 50 years, which cemented R.W.'s position at the crossroads of Anglo-American letters.
So this connection simultaneously exposed him to European thought while also funding his eventual move toward self-sufficiency.
Exactly.
But the moment that solidified his new post-theological philosophy, the moment that truly shifted his focus from the pulpit to the natural world, that happened in Paris.
The visionary moment at the Jardin des Plantes.
Yeah.
The botanical garden. He visited this immense garden and was exposed to Jussieu's classification system.
So he's just looking at plants.
But he didn't just see neatly labeled plants. He saw a cosmic ordering. He was profoundly moved by the systematic arrangement, finding a deep, organizing insight into the interconnectedness of things.
How does cataloging plants shift a man from theology to philosophy? I mean, what's the connection there?
It provided a new source of revelation.
Sure.
For Emerson, the universe suddenly appeared not as a chaotic collection of discrete parts, but as a unified, organized expression of a single mind, a divine mind.
So God wasn't in the church, God was in the system.
That's it. The source of truth was no longer a historical text, a miracle, or a prophet. The source of truth was the living, breathing, scientifically organized reality of nature itself. And this realization pointed him definitively away from rigid theology and toward a holistic philosophy centered on science and spiritual unity.
He returned in October 1833, knowing exactly where he needed to speak. The Lyceum movement, the booming lecture circuit, was the perfect platform for the minister without a church.
And this was the crucial difference between the old world and the new. America provided a commercial, decentralized way for a thinker to reach the public directly, bypassing universities and established churches.
He found his new pulpit.
He did. On November 5, 1833, he gave the first of what would be around 1,500 lectures, The Uses of Natural History, which was essentially a philosophical expansion of his experience at the Jardin des Plantes.
And this lecture became his new mission statement, reframing nature not as a backdrop for human life, but as a living language.
Exactly. He introduced the core concept that would define his life's work. He saw nature as a language where every fact is a word, but it wasn't a dead language found in a dictionary. He described it as the language put together into a most significant and universal sense.
So the goal of the Transcendentalist.
And the goal he set for himself was to read the great book that is written in that tongue. Understanding nature was understanding God.
By 1835, he was settled in Concord, Massachusetts, having bought the house that would become the Ralph Waldo Emerson house, and he married his second wife, Lydia Jackson.
Yes.
And speaking of rejecting inherited names and tradition, he immediately renamed her.
Yes, he renamed her Lydian. And this detail, which seems small, actually reflects a huge philosophical principle for him, the power of self-creation.
If the world is a language, you have the right to rename the words within your own life.
That's exactly his thinking. He didn't want the inherited identity associated with the name Lydia.
This personal reorganization led directly to the philosophical revolution 1836, with the anonymous publication of his first and most defining essay, Nature.
And this essay wasn't just commentary, it was the formal articulation of transcendentalism. It defined the universe philosophically in two parts, nature and the soul.
This is where his pandeism comes into play.
Right. Pandeism, or pantheism, the rejection of God as a separate external creator, was radical. Emerson proposed that God was immanent. God was the world, the natural processes, and the soul residing within every individual.
So the term transcendentalism itself, what does it actually mean for you, the listener, who may not be steeped in 19th century philosophy?
At its heart, transcendentalism meant that true reality, the essential truth, transcends the sensory, measurable world. It means that humans possess an innate capacity, an intuition, to know truth directly,
Bypassing the five senses.
and bypassing the rigid structures of society, religion, or science. If God is immanent, then revelation is constant and available to everyone all the time through nature and through the individual soul.
This philosophical ferment quickly found a physical home.
It did. The very month Nature was published, RWE met with Frederick Henry Hedge, George Putnam, and George Ripley to establish a new intellectual circle. This became the Transcendental Club.
And what was its purpose?
It was designed to be a meeting place for ideas that just couldn't fit into the existing Unitarian or academic institutions. And it's important to note the progressive nature of this group, too.
How so?
When they formalized in September 1837, they invited women to attend, including major intellectuals like Margaret Fuller, Elizabeth Hoare, and Sarah Ripley, giving women a vital early role in American philosophical discourse.
And all this intellectual activity culminated in what is often considered the American Intellectual Declaration of Independence, his 1837 address, The American Scholar.
This speech was an electrifying call to action delivered at Harvard. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. recognized its immense gravity immediately, and he's the one who gave it that famous title.
So what was he arguing?
RWE was essentially urging the nation to start being a provincial outpost of Europe. For too long, he argued, America had been content to read European books and follow European philosophical trends.
So he told the American Scholar to do what, specifically?
He told them to stop mirroring and start creating. He demanded that American writers find a distinct style and philosophy free from Europe. The American scholar must be independent. A man thinking, not a mere echo.
And the public reaction was huge.
Massive. While a few conservative members of the audience dismissed it as incoherent and unintelligible, the vast majority, including young writers like James Russell Lowell, saw it as a monumental turning point. Lowell called it an event without former parallel on our literary annals. It sold out immediately.
He had laid down the gauntlet. The era of intellectual deference was over.
It was a whole new game.
The period immediately following the Nature essay and the American Scholar was Emerson's most prolific. We're talking the mid-1830s to the mid-1840s.
Right. This decade produced the definitive expression of his philosophy in his two collections. Essays. First series, which was in 1841, and Essays. Second series in 1844.
And these essays, which were primarily refined lectures, represent the complete framework of his thought.
Exactly. They focus on the core transcendentalist principles, the sovereignty of the individual, the concept of divine freedom accessible to all, the belief in man's ability to achieve profound self-realization.
And the unity of the human spirit with the cosmic spirit.
Right.
And among those foundational titles, the poet circles experience, one stands above the rest as the ultimate distillation of this new American creed. Self-Reliance.
That essay achieved international fame precisely because of its radical, uncompromising mandate. It was so radical, in fact, that we noted earlier his own aunt, Mary Moody Emerson, dismissed it.
What did she call it?
A strange medley of atheism and false independence. It demanded a total severance from inherited belief.
So what is the practical mandate of self-reliance for you, the listener? We hear the term all the time, but what did RWE actually mean by it?
Well, it's not just about paying your own bills. It's a radical spiritual and intellectual independence. Emerson's core doctrine here is the infinitude of the private man.
The infinitude of the private man. What does that mean?
It means that the individual soul contains everything necessary for moral and spiritual guidance. If you trust your spontaneous intuition, your genuine thought, it is a piece of the divine speaking through you.
So if that inner intuition is divine, what does that demand of a person's life?
Total nonconformity. He famously wrote, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines."
So consistency is a chain.
For Emerson, yes. If you rely on institutions, past actions, or the opinions of society to guide you, you deny the spontaneous divine truth that wells up in you right now. He argued that society is always in a conspiracy against the maturity of its members. You must resist that pressure.
But this introduces a fascinating irony. He preaches total detachment and reliance on the self, yet he only achieved the stability necessary to write these essays because of institutional means.
A huge paradox. The very financial independence that allowed him to be the infinitude of the private man was secured via inherited wealth.
From his first wife, Ellen's estate.
Right, and we have to acknowledge the historical irony. He actually had to sue Ellen's family for the money in 1836, eventually receiving over $23,000 in 2 payments.
So the man who argued against the tyranny of inherited forms and the necessity of tradition had to engage in the most formal of institutions, a court of law, to gain the freedom to reject them.
It's incredible when you think about it, that grounding in the material world is always there, just beneath the philosophy.
Okay, let's turn to the spiritual culmination of his thought, the oversoul. This essay reveals that his individualism was deeply spiritual and surprisingly influenced by non-Western thought.
This is a crucial point that elevates Emerson beyond simply being a witty Yankee essayist. Starting around 1845, he was profoundly influenced by Indian philosophy.
He was reading the Bhagavad Gita.
The Bhagavad Gita and scholarly essays on the Vedas. This exposure gave him a philosophical framework for that unity he'd sensed back in the Jardin des Plantes.
The influence is really visible in the oversoul, which speaks to non-dualism. For you, the listener, what is non-dualism in this context?
Non-dualism fundamentally is the philosophical rejection of duality. It means that there is no ultimate separation between self and God, or between the spiritual and the physical world.
It's all one.
Everything that appears separate, the parts, the particles, are actually manifestations of a single unified reality.
And Emerson captured this sense of ultimate unity perfectly in that famous passage from the essay.
He writes, "We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, the eternal one."
That's not just a theological idea, it's an instruction.
Exactly. If you, the individual, possess the soul of the whole, then you have no need for external mediators, no need for priests or institutions to tell you what is true.
So the practical application of his deep dive into Asian studies was what exactly?
It fundamentally shifted the religious focus. He concluded that the central message he drew was that the purpose of life was spiritual transformation and direct experience of divine power here and now on earth.
The divine is not waiting for you in the afterlife.
It is accessible in the present moment through self-trust and communion with nature.
And this philosophical shift set the stage for the most famous scandal of his early career, the 1838 Divinity School Address. He brought his radical, non-dual, self-reliant philosophy right back to the Harvard establishment that had birthed him.
It was essentially a declaration of war against the remnants of organized religion. Speaking at the Harvard Divinity School graduation, he presented his most revolutionary religious ideas.
What was the main point?
The key point was his critique of historical Christianity. He argued that it was fixated on the historical figure of Jesus rather than the moral power he represented.
And the specific offense, what really set them off?
He discounted biblical miracles as secondary and stated emphatically that Jesus was a great man, an exemplary personification of the oversoul, but he was not God in a unique, singular sense.
So Jesus was just a guy. A really great guy, but just a guy.
A great man who understood his own divinity, which is something everyone could do. He argued that historical Christianity had turned Jesus into a demigod, making the church reliant on historical testimony rather than present truth. He said the church taught that the divine spirit spoke only through Jesus, but the truth was that the spirit should speak through every individual.
Including those graduates sitting right in front of him.
Right. This sounds almost reasonable to a modern listener, but in conservative Unitarian Boston, this was blasphemy.
It was explosive.
Even the Unitarians, the intellectual liberal backbone of Boston society, could not tolerate this idea. RW was immediately denounced from pulpits across New England as an infidel, a nihilist, and a poisoner of young men's minds.
And the consequences were severe.
He was functionally blacklisted. He was not invited back to speak at Harvard for another 30 years.
And what's crucial is Emerson's reaction, or lack thereof, to the whole storm.
He offered no defense, no reply to the critics. He just moved on, continuing to lecture and write.
He used the controversy as proof of his own doctrine.
Absolutely. He had followed his inner voice, and the institutions were proving themselves to be exactly what he called them, stuck in dead forms.
He had to move on quickly, because he had to earn a living. The professional philosopher of spiritual detachment made his money not from writing, but from grueling, tireless work as a popular lecturer.
The Lyceum circuit was his financial salvation. He managed his own lecture series, which was an early form of self-publishing and direct-to-consumer content.
How much was he making?
He charged between $10 and $50 per appearance, and in a successful winter season, he could net as much as $2,000.
That's an incredible income for the era.
Far more than his earnings from published books or inherited funds.
And we're talking about serious physical work. This wasn't just him sitting in Concord writing poems.
Oh, far from it. He gave approximately 1,500 lectures in his lifetime, sometimes delivering up to 80 lectures a year.
And he was traveling everywhere.
Across the increasingly vast United States, going as far west as St. Louis, Des Moines, Minneapolis, and even California in later years. He endured terrible travel conditions, cold hotel rooms, and indifferent audiences.
So it really grounds the sage of Concord, not just as a lofty thinker, but as a practical, hard-working professional.
He earned his intellectual freedom one lecture fee at a time. The champion of the infinitude of the private man secured his financial footing and his 14 acres by Walden Pond through sheer entrepreneurial effort.
Proving that self-reliance, ironically, required incredible persistence in the commercial sphere.
Paradoxes just keep piling up.
Emerson wasn't just working in isolation. He was a cultural center and a generous mentor, particularly to the younger generation of American writers who flocked to Concord.
Right. His relationship with Henry David Thoreau is probably the most famous.
He was a crucial mentor to Thoreau.
Absolutely. The relationship was cemented in 1837 when RWE asked Thoreau a simple, defining question. Do you keep a journal?
And coming from the man whose own journal was the source of all his philosophy.
That question was a lifelong inspiration for Thoreau. It prompted him to begin the massive journal project that became the heart of his literary output. Emerson also provided Thoreau with a place to live, acting as a patron for the young naturalist and thinker.
Despite this mentorship, the relationship had its difficulties, right? Its breaks.
It did. The sources note a falling out around 1849, largely concerning Thoreau's publication of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. There were professional disagreements and even a dispute over the boundaries of property and ownership.
But RWE, despite these issues, clearly held Thoreau in the highest regard.
Oh yeah, often referring to him as his best friend. He even delivered Thoreau's eulogy in 1862 after Thoreau died of tuberculosis.
He also maintained connections with other literary giants of the period, demonstrating his centrality to the American canon. He was a pallbearer for Nathaniel Hawthorne in 1864.
And we get a great glimpse into the communal life of the Transcendentalists with the Philosopher's Camp in 1858.
This wasn't a spiritual retreat.
No, this was an incredibly high-powered 2-week excursion into the true wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains. Emerson camped with 9 other leading figures, including the famous scientist Louis Agassiz and the editor James Russell Lowell.
The public image of these cultured intellectuals, the Saturday Club, living like Saxons Sioux in the wild, must have been shocking to the urban readers of the time.
But it reinforced his philosophical point that true understanding required communion with nature, not just reading about it. For RWE, the experience reaffirmed that in the wilderness, I find something more dear and connate than in streets or villages. It was a living embodiment of the nature essay.
Okay, now let's transition from the supportive friendships to a more complicated, almost adversarial relationship. The exchange with Walt Whitman.
Oh, this is where Emerson's philosophy was tested by an entirely new, radical generation.
So Whitman, the great radical American poet, published his experimental first edition of Leaves of Grass in 1855.
Right. And he immediately sent a copy to Emerson, seeking validation. Emerson, recognizing the revolutionary spirit in the work, responded with a genuinely flattering 5-page private letter praising Whitman and calling the collection a great career.
That must have been the ultimate seal of approval for Whitman, coming from the Sage of Concord.
It was a massive career-making endorsement. But Whitman, embracing this aggressive self-promotion that was completely antithetical to Emerson's more refined individualism,
What did he do?
he immediately violated the privacy of the correspondence. For the second edition of Leaves of Grass, he printed an excerpt from Emerson's private letter, specifically the line, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career," in literal gold leaf on the spine of the book.
Wow. That is the ultimate act of self-reliance, divorced from any sense of decorum.
Exactly. It was crass commercialization of a philosophical endorsement. Emerson took significant offense that his private letter was made public and became visibly cooler toward Whitman's work later on, particularly his more explicit content.
It showed the limits of his acceptance.
Yeah, when his own name and reputation were used for such bold, public self-advertisement.
We need to pivot now to the most complex and ethically fraught part of Emerson's public life, his gradual, often contradictory journey toward abolitionism and his fraught, evolving views on race. This requires impartial, detailed reporting on the sources.
This is a deep dive into complexity because the sources show that RWE's internal philosophy, that belief in the infinitude of the private man, initially clashed with the necessity of collective political action.
He was always against slavery.
Staunchly opposed to it. His journals show this concern from his youth, even dreaming of helping to free slaves. However, he disliked the heat and public aggression of the abolition movement and hesitated to lecture publicly on it until 1844.
But he eventually did commit, becoming a firm public voice against the institution and welcoming radical abolitionists like John Brown into his home in Concord.
Right. When he committed, he provided the moral grounding for the movement. He defined slavery as a deep moral and ethical injustice. In 1844, he declared the movement indispensable, stating, "We are indebted mainly to this movement for the popular discussion of every point of practical ethics."
He saw it as forcing America to confront its own moral foundation.
His first major public anti-slavery address was actually provoked in 1838 following the mob murder of the abolitionist publisher Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, a true crime that shocked his conscience.
However, the sources reveal that his personal, internal intellectual hierarchy regarding race was deeply problematic, particularly in his early years.
And this may have contributed to his earlier reluctance to join the movement. We must report on this carefully. While he saw slavery as a moral injustice that contradicted Christian ethics, his early intellectual framework contained troubling racial hierarchies.
He struggled with the concept of racial capacity.
He analyzed it through the flawed pseudosciences that were common in the period.
We have that quote from a very early journal entry from 1822 that captures this problematic thinking.
In that entry, he records his observation and subsequent questioning regarding the intellect of enslaved Africans he encountered. He wrote, "I saw 10, 20, 100 large-lipped, low-browed black men in the streets who, except in the mere matter of language, did not exceed the sagacity of the elephant."
Yeah, he questions their place in creation.
He does. He continues, "Now, is it true that these were created superior to this wise animal and designed to control it?" He concluded that compared to the highest orders of men, the difference between Africans and sagacious beasts seemed inconsiderable.
So that early view suggests a moral opposition to the practice of slavery, the cruelty and the removal from one's homeland, but a lack of belief in the inherent equality of different races at that time.
That separation is critical for understanding his evolution. For Emerson, the gross injustice was the treatment of human beings. He wrote that no ingenious sophistry can ever reconcile the unperverted mind to the pardon of slavery. But his intellectual framework was still colored by a sense of racial superiority.
And this extended even to European immigrants.
It did. He identified strongly with his Saxon descent, and in an 1835 speech, he characterized native-born white Americans of English ancestry as the superior race in America, setting a cultural standard. He ranked them above European immigrants, the Irish, French, and Germans, and even ranked them above English people from England.
So how does the complex racial view evolve as the nation hurtled toward the Civil War? What was the final dialectic of change?
Later in life, Emerson shifted his views, incorporating the idea of hybridization and national destiny. He began to view the escalating conflicts, including enslavement and subsequent emancipation, as a necessary and inevitable racial struggle.
That would result in what?
The eventual union and strengthening of the United States. He theorized that the mixing of European races in America, the great melting pot, even if he initially ranked them, would ultimately lead to a new, superior national character, advantageous to the superiority of the nation itself.
It was a philosophy of progress achieved through struggle, though rooted in race-based reasoning.
A very 19th century way of looking at it.
During the Civil War itself, RWE voted for Abraham Lincoln in 1860, but initially harbored major misgivings about the president's priorities.
He was deeply disappointed that Lincoln focused initially on preserving the Union rather than making the war explicitly about abolishing slavery. For Emerson, the moral imperative outweighed the political strategy.
He didn't hold back when he gave his public lecture at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. in 1862.
Not at all. He stated his position unequivocally, declaring, "The South calls slavery an institution. I call it destitution. Emancipation is the demand of civilization." For RWE, the Union could not be preserved if it meant preserving a moral crime.
He actually met Lincoln at the White House the day after that speech. Did that personal encounter shift his view of the man?
It did. Lincoln, who knew and respected Emerson's writing, impressed the philosopher deeply. While RWE had come to criticize, he left having softened his misgivings about the president's leadership.
And the tragic aftermath cemented his respect.
It did. In 1865, speaking at Lincoln's memorial service, Emerson spoke to the scale of the national grief, saying, "I doubt if any death has caused so much pain as this has caused, or will have caused, on its announcement."
Beginning around 1867, the relentless intellectual energy that fueled 1,500 lectures and countless essays began to noticeably fade.
Yeah, his journal entries became sparse, which signaled a decline in his health and his mental faculties.
The decline was difficult. By 1871 and 1872, he suffered from severe memory problems and aphasia difficulty with language. His memory loss became public and often embarrassing as the decade wore on.
He would occasionally forget the names of his closest friends or even his own name.
There's that incredibly poignant quote that summarizes his final state, capturing the philosopher's detachment even from his own declining mind.
When asked how he felt, his signature response became a heartbreaking encapsulation of his final years. He would say, "Quite well. I have lost my mental faculties, but I'm perfectly well."
Wow. It suggests a final, ultimate self-reliance, a spiritual peace detached from the malfunctioning machine of his physical brain.
A very Emersonian way to face the end.
A physical crisis soon mirrored the mental one. His Concord home caught fire in July 1872.
Yes, his house, which he affectionately called Bush, burned. Neighbors rushed to help him save his possessions, including many of his manuscripts and books. But what happened next is the ultimate contradiction to his philosophy of self-reliance.
The community stepped up immediately.
In a huge way. Recognizing his immense cultural value, they organized a massive fundraising effort. Francis Cabot Lowell raised $5,000. LeBaron Russell Briggs collected another $10,000, and George Bancroft personally contributed $1,000.
In total, they raised over $16,000.
A phenomenal sum for the 1870s to ensure his home was rebuilt exactly as it was. Massive communal support for the man who told everyone to stand alone.
And while the home was being rebuilt, he took one final grand tour, sailing abroad with his daughter Ellen, visiting Europe and Egypt.
His return to Concord in April 1873 was a major community event. The town, which had nurtured him, celebrated his arrival with such fervor that school was canceled for the day in his honor.
But his public career was nearly over.
His memory constraints forced him to cease public appearances entirely by 1879.
He died of pneumonia in 1882 and was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, the town he made famous. But his physical death only marked the beginning of his true immortality.
His enduring influence is simply staggering. RWE is the linchpin of the American Romantic movement and arguably the most influential writer of 19th century America.
I mean, today, if you study philosophy at Harvard, the department is housed in Emerson Hall.
A physical testament to his institutional importance, despite his anti-institutional philosophy.
And his legacy stretches far beyond mere academia. We see him echoing in unexpected places.
Certainly. His poetic theories, focusing on rhythm and the natural breath, foreshadowed the concepts of projective verse articulated by poets like Charles Olson in the mid-20th century. And his direct influence shaped the next century's philosophical giants, including his own godson, William James, the father of American psychology.
Literary critics place him at the very center of the American spiritual and intellectual landscape. Harold Bloom famously called him the prophet of the American religion.
Right, and he argued that his influence was so pervasive that even writers who fiercely opposed him, figures like Herman Melville and Henry James, were essentially Emersonians in denial.
You could either build on his ideas or you could react against them, but you couldn't ignore them.
You couldn't. And finally, we circle back to his global role. His intense study of the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas cemented his position among the key Western thinkers who introduced Hindu spiritual traditions to a Western audience. He created a bridge where Eastern non-dualism met American individualism.
He was, in essence, the ultimate catalyst for the American search for a personal, spiritual truth. He was truly the pivot point that allowed America to become intellectually self-reliant.
A perfect summary.
So what does this all mean for us today? Ralph Waldo Emerson gave us a philosophical roadmap focused on radical self-trust, an intense connection with nature, and finding divinity not in historical tradition, but within the infinitude of the private man.
He rejected dogma, institutional constraint, and intellectual difference.
He told the young nation and all of us as individuals to look inward, find our unique voice, and trust it implicitly.
But what's fascinating here is the sheer weight of the paradox we've uncovered. RWE, the champion of perfect self-reliance, was profoundly shaped by external crises.
The death of Ellen.
The classification system at the Jardin des Plantes, the shock of slavery, the communal response to the Civil War. His defining ideas were not formed in splendid isolation. They were forged and honed in response to profound personal tragedy and massive national fire.
The ultimate disconnect, really. And that brings us to our provocative final thought for you to mull over until our next deep dive. RWD's core idea of personal isolation for spiritual clarity was beautifully summarized in his famous dictum: "The soul is no traveler. The wise man stays at home with the soul."
Yet we know he was constantly traveling, lecturing across the U.S. and Europe.
He was the ultimate champion of self-reliance, earning his freedom through entrepreneurial effort. Yet when his home burned down, his entire stability relied heavily on the swift, generous support and community donations from his friends and neighbors.
So where's the line?
That's the question. In our modern quest for fierce, sometimes isolated independence, how do we reconcile Emerson's ideal of staying at home with the soul, with the vital, undeniable truth of his own life, that even the sage needs connection, community, and aid? Where do you draw the line between necessary self-reliance and the vital need for communal support?
Something to chew on until our next deep dive.